The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone streets of Vienna as Prince Rudolf of Austria-Hungary adjusted his military uniform for the final time. His hands trembled slightly as he fastened the golden buttons, each one bearing the imperial eagle that had watched over his family for centuries. Today was supposed to be the most important day of his life, the day he would marry Princess Stephanie of Belgium and secure the future of the Habsburg dynasty. In the ornate mirror of his chambers, Rudolf saw not just a prince preparing for his wedding, but a man caught between duty and desire, between the weight of an empire and the yearnings of his own heart. At 22, he had already lived through more political intrigue and family pressure than most men would experience in a lifetime. His father, Emperor Franz Joseph, had made it clear that this marriage was not about love, but about strengthening alliances and ensuring the continuation of their royal bloodline. The palace bustled with activity as servants hurried through the corridors, carrying flowers, adjusting decorations, and making final preparations for what was being called the wedding of the century. Dignitaries from across Europe had traveled to witness this union, their carriages filling the courtyards and their jewels glittering in the morning light. The archbishop himself had arrived from Rome, carrying papal blessings and ancient ceremonies that would bind Rudolf not just to his bride, but to his destiny as future emperor. Princess Stephanie waited in her own chambers, surrounded by ladies-in-waiting who fussed over every detail of her elaborate white gown. She was young, beautiful, and well-educated, everything that a future empress should be. Yet as she looked at herself in the mirror, she too felt the weight of expectations pressing down upon her shoulders. This marriage would make her one of the most powerful women in Europe, but it would also chain her to a life she had not chosen, to a man she barely knew. The wedding preparations had taken months to complete. Every flower had been selected for its symbolic meaning, every piece of music chosen to reflect the grandeur of the Habsburg legacy. The cathedral had been transformed into a golden paradise, with thousands of candles casting dancing shadows on the ancient walls. Outside, crowds had gathered in the streets, hoping to catch a glimpse of their future emperor and empress as they made their way to the ceremony. But behind all the pageantry and celebration, darker currents were flowing. Through the empire, nationalist movements were stirring in Hungary and Bohemia, challenging the authority of the Habsburg crown. The Ottoman Empire was weakening, creating opportunities and dangers in the Balkans. Russia was expanding its influence, and new alliances were forming that would reshape the map of Europe. Rudolf understood these pressures better than most, having been educated not just in ceremony and tradition, but in the harsh realities of international politics. As the morning progressed, Rudolf found himself thinking not of his bride or his duties, but of a conversation he had had with his father just days before. The emperor had spoken of sacrifice, of putting the needs of the empire above personal desires. He had reminded Rudolf that their family had ruled for centuries, precisely because they understood that individual happiness was less important than the stability of the realm. Yet Rudolf wondered if this wisdom was still relevant in a changing world, if the old ways of thinking could address the new challenges they faced. The prince's closest advisors had noticed his growing restlessness in recent weeks. He had always been more liberal in his thinking than his conservative father, more willing to consider reforms that might address the grievances of their diverse subjects. Some whispered that he was too influenced by progressive ideas, too willing to challenge traditions that had served the empire well. Others believed that his modern outlook was exactly what Austria-Hungary needed to navigate the turbulent waters ahead. In the cathedral, guests took their seats according to strict protocols that had been refined over generations. Ambassadors from France, Germany, and Russia sat near the front, their presence a reminder of the complex web of alliances and rivalries that defined European politics. Military officers in full dress uniforms represented the various branches of the imperial forces, while church leaders spoke quietly among themselves about the significance of this union for the Catholic faith in Central Europe. The bride's procession was scheduled to begin within the hour, followed by the groom's formal entrance. Every step had been choreographed, every word of the ceremony planned to reinforce the legitimacy and power of the Habsburg dynasty. The rings had been blessed, the vows prepared, and the documents of state ready for signing. In every visible way, this wedding would proceed exactly as hundreds of royal ceremonies had before it. Yet Rudolf stood at his window, looking out over the city that would one day be entirely under his rule, and felt a growing sense of unease. The weight of history pressed upon him, the expectations of millions of subjects who looked to the imperial family for leadership and stability. He thought of the letters he had received from various parts of the empire, some expressing loyalty and devotion, others hinting at dissatisfaction and change. The sound of church bells began to ring across Vienna, their bronze voices calling, the faithful to witness this sacred union. In palaces and peasant cottages alike, people prepared to celebrate or simply to observe what many believed would be a turning point in their nation's story. Children were dressed in their finest clothes, women arranged their hair according to the latest fashions, and men polished their boots and adjusted their ties. As Rudolf prepared to leave his chambers and join the procession that would carry him toward the altar, he paused for a moment of reflection. In his heart, he carried not just personal doubts about his marriage, but deeper questions about the future of his empire and his role in shaping it. The next few hours would bind him to responsibilities that would define not just his own life, but the lives of millions of people across Central and Eastern Europe. The young prince straightened his shoulders, took a deep breath, and stepped toward the door that would lead him to his destiny. Behind him, the morning sun continued to stream through the palace windows, illuminating portraits of his ancestors who had faced their own moments of decision, their own tests of character and resolve. Today, it would be Rudolf's turn to step into the pages of history, though none of those watching could have imagined the dramatic turn that awaited them all. The cathedral doors opened with a resonance that seemed to echo through the very foundations of the Habsburg Empire. Princess Stephanie entered on the arm of her father, King Leopold II of Belgium, her silk train flowing behind her like a river of pearls and diamonds. The assembled nobility rose as one, their jewels catching the light of 1,000 candles and creating a constellation of earthly stars beneath the vaulted ceiling. Rudolf watched from his position at the altar. His face, a mask of composure that concealed the storm raging within his mind. He had practiced this moment countless times, rehearsed every gesture and response that would be expected of him. Yet as his bride approached, he found himself thinking not of the ceremony ahead, but of a letter he had received just that morning from his cousin, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, warning him about rumors circulating in the imperial court. The letter had spoken of whispered conversations in shadowy corners, of ministers who questioned Rudolf's commitment to the conservative policies that had kept the empire stable for so long. There were suggestions that his liberal sympathies might make him unsuitable for the throne, that his willingness to consider reforms could be seen as weakness by their enemies both within and beyond their borders. Franz Ferdinand had written with genuine concern, urging Rudolf to be more careful about the company he kept and the ideas he expressed. As Princess Stephanie drew closer, Rudolf could see the determination in her eyes, the royal bearing that had been instilled in her from childhood. She was not just a bride coming to her wedding, but a princess accepting her role in the great game of European politics. Her marriage to Rudolf would strengthen the ties between Belgium and Austria-Hungary, creating new opportunities for trade and military cooperation. It was a strategic alliance dressed in the beautiful clothing of romance and ceremony. The Archbishop of Vienna stood ready to perform the service, his ornate vestments reflecting centuries of tradition and religious authority. In his hands, he held the ancient texts that would bind these two young people not just to each other, but to the destiny of their nations. The words he would speak had been used to unite royal couples for generations, creating bonds that were intended to last not just for a lifetime, but for eternity. Among the wedding guests, careful observers might have noticed subtle signs of the tensions that were building across Europe. The German ambassador sat slightly apart from his Austrian counterparts, reflecting the complex relationship between the two German-speaking empires. The French representatives maintained polite but distant expressions, still remembering the wounds of recent conflicts. Russian diplomats watched everything with the calculating eyes of men who understood that today's alliance might become tomorrow's enmity. Rudolph's own family occupied the front rows, their faces reflecting generations of imperial breeding and control. His mother, Empress Elizabeth, sat with the perfect posture that had made her famous throughout Europe, though those who knew her well could detect a hint of sadness in her eyes. She understood better than most the sacrifices that royal duty demanded, having herself married for political reasons rather than love. His father, Emperor Franz Joseph, projected the stern dignity that had made him one of Europe's most respected monarchs, yet even he seemed touched by the solemnity of the moment. The ceremony began with ancient prayers and blessings, words that had been spoken in this same cathedral for centuries. The archbishop's voice carried clearly through the vast space, reaching every corner where diplomats, nobles, and high-ranking clergy sat in respectful silence. Outside, crowds had gathered in the streets, straining to hear any sound from within that might tell them how the ceremony was proceeding. As the service continued, Rudolph found his attention drifting to the political implications of what was taking place. This marriage would make him not just a husband, but a key player in the complex web of alliances that kept Europe from descending into chaos. Belgium's strategic location and industrial resources would become valuable assets for Austria-Hungary, while his empire's military strength would provide security for his bride's homeland. Yet Rudolph also understood that marriage into the Habsburg family came with expectations that extended far beyond personal happiness. Stephanie would be expected to produce heirs who could continue the dynasty, to support her husband's political decisions even when they conflicted with her own beliefs, and to represent the empire with grace and dignity in courts across Europe. The beautiful young woman standing beside him was accepting a role that would define every aspect of her future life. The exchange of rings approached, that moment when two separate lives would be formally joined into one. Rudolph held the golden band that had been crafted specifically for this occasion, its surface engraved with symbols representing both the Habsburg eagle and the Belgian lion. It was a physical representation of the union between their two nations, a reminder that this marriage was about much more than the personal feelings of the bride and groom. In the congregation, military officers from both countries watched with professional interest, already calculating how this alliance might affect their strategic planning. Businessmen considered new opportunities for trade and investment. Church leaders reflected on the religious implications of uniting two Catholic royal houses. Every person present understood that they were witnessing not just a wedding, but a moment that would influence the course of European history. As the archbishop prepared to ask for the formal vows that would complete the ceremony, a subtle change seemed to pass through the cathedral. Those closest to the altar later claimed they saw Rudolph's expression shift slightly, as if he had suddenly remembered something important or reached some internal decision. His hand, which had been steady throughout the service, appeared to tremble for just a moment as he prepared to speak the words that would bind him forever to his imperial destiny. The bride waited with the patience that had been trained into her since childhood, ready to speak her own vows and accept the enormous responsibilities that came with becoming the future Empress of Austria-Hungary. Around them, the greatest figures in European society held their breath, waiting to witness the moment when two young lives would be joined in service to something larger than themselves. The cathedral fell into perfect silence as the archbishop, raised his hand to begin the final phase of the ceremony. Candles flickered in the stillness, their light playing across the faces of guests who had traveled from across the continent to witness this historic union. In that moment of profound quiet, with all of Europe watching, Rudolf of Austria-Hungary stepped forward to meet his destiny and speak the words that everyone expected to hear. The Archbishop's voice filled the cathedral as he began the ancient words that would seal the union between Prince Rudolf and Princess Stephanie. His Latin phrases echoed off the stone walls, carrying with them the weight of centuries of royal tradition and religious authority. The gathered nobility leaned forward slightly, as if drawn by the gravity of this moment that would reshape the political landscape of Europe. Do you, Rudolf Franz Karl Joseph, take this woman as your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, until death do you part? Rudolf stood perfectly still, his military uniform immaculate, his posture straight and dignified. Yet those closest to him noticed something strange in his eyes, a distant look as if he were seeing something far beyond the walls of the cathedral. The silence stretched longer than protocol dictated, long enough for whispers of concern to begin among the wedding guests. In that extended moment, Rudolf's mind raced through memories and possibilities that had nothing to do with the ceremony, unfolding around him. He thought of his recent travels through the remote provinces of his father's empire, where he had seen poverty and discontent that official reports had never mentioned. He remembered conversations with Hungarian nobles who spoke quietly about independence, with Czech intellectuals who dreamed of their own national revival, with Serbian merchants who looked toward Russia rather than Vienna for their future. The empire that he was about to inherit was not the stable, unified realm that his ancestors had ruled. It was a collection of different peoples, languages, and cultures held together more by habit and fear than by loyalty or love. Rudolf had spent sleepless nights wondering if the old ways of governing could survive in a world that was changing faster than anyone had anticipated. Princess Stephanie remained perfectly composed, though a slight furrow appeared between her eyebrows as the silence continued. She had been prepared for many possibilities on her wedding day, but not for this strange hesitation from her groom. Her training as a royal princess had taught her to maintain dignity under all circumstances, yet even she could sense that something unexpected was happening. Emperor Franz Joseph sat rigidly in his seat, his face betraying no emotion despite the growing awkwardness of the situation. As a ruler who had survived multiple wars, rebellions, and diplomatic crises, he understood the importance of maintaining appearances even when events took unexpected turns. Yet inwardly, he felt a growing alarm as he watched his son stand motionless before the altar. The whispers among the guests grew slightly louder, a barely audible buzz that seemed to fill the vast space of the cathedral. Ambassadors exchanged meaningful glances, wondering if this hesitation signified some deeper political issue they had not been informed about. Military officers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, unsure whether they were witnessing a minor protocol error or something more significant. Rudolf's personal secretary, who had served the prince for several years, recognized the look on his master's face. He had seen it before during their late-night discussions about the future of the empire, when Rudolf would stare out the window and speak of his fears that traditional monarchy might not survive the challenges of the modern world. The secretary felt a growing sense of dread as he realized that this was not simple wedding nervousness. The bride's father, King Leopold II of Belgium, maintained his royal composure while silently calculating the diplomatic implications of any delay or disruption to the ceremony. This marriage had been negotiated over months of careful discussion involving trade agreements, military cooperation, and mutual defense treaties. Any problem with the wedding could unravel agreements that went far beyond the personal happiness of his daughter. In the back of the cathedral, representatives of the press waited with notebooks, ready to record every detail of what they had expected. to be a straightforward royal ceremony. Instead, they found themselves witnessing something unprecedented, a moment of hesitation that would require careful interpretation in their reports to newspapers across Europe. They sensed that they might be observing history in the making, though none could have predicted the direction it would take. Rudolph's closest friend, Count Joseph Hoyos, who had agreed to serve as his best man, stood just behind the prince and could see the tension in his friend's shoulders. Hoyos had noticed Rudolph's increasing melancholy in recent weeks, his tendency to speak about duty and sacrifice in ways that suggested deep personal conflict. Now, watching Rudolph stand motionless before the altar, Hoyos began to fear that his friend might be approaching some kind of personal crisis. The archbishop, experienced in conducting ceremonies for the highest levels of European nobility, maintained his dignity while allowing a few extra moments for the prince to collect himself. He had officiated at enough royal weddings to understand that the pressure of such occasions could sometimes overwhelm even the most prepared participants. Yet he too began to sense that this hesitation was different from ordinary nervousness. Among the wedding guests, subtle movements began to occur as people tried to understand what was happening. Heads turned slightly toward the imperial family, seeking clues about whether this delay was part of some ceremony they didn't understand or represented a genuine problem. The carefully choreographed atmosphere of the wedding began to show small cracks as uncertainty spread through the congregation. Rudolph's mother, Empress Elizabeth, felt her heart begin to race as maternal instinct told her that her son was struggling with something far more serious than wedding jitters. She had always been closer to Rudolph than protocol typically allowed between royal mothers and their children, and she could read the signs of deep internal conflict in his posture and expression. Her hands clenched slightly in her lap as she willed him to find the strength to continue with the ceremony. The candles throughout the cathedral continued to burn steadily, their flames unwavering despite the growing tension in the air. The flowers that had been arranged so carefully that morning remained beautiful and fragrant, creating an atmosphere of celebration that contrasted sharply with the uncertainty that now filled the space. Outside, crowds continued to wait patiently, unaware that anything unusual was occurring within the sacred walls. As the silence extended beyond what anyone could consider normal, Rudolph slowly raised his head and looked directly at Princess Stephanie. In her eyes, he saw not just a beautiful young woman ready to become his wife, but a symbol of everything that his imperial destiny represented. The marriage would bind him not just to her, but to a future that had been planned by others, to responsibilities that would define every remaining day of his life. The moment had arrived when Rudolph would either speak the expected words and accept his predetermined fate or choose a different path entirely. In that crystalline instant, with all of Europe's nobility watching and waiting, the young prince stood on the threshold between duty and desire, between the weight of history and the call of his own conscience. The cathedral held its collective breath as Prince Rudolph finally opened his mouth to speak. Every eye in the vast space was fixed upon him, every ear straining to hear the words that would either fulfill centuries of Habsburg tradition or shatter it entirely. The candlelight seemed to flicker more intensely, as if the very air itself had become charged with anticipation and dread. "I cannot," Rudolph said, his voice carrying clearly through the silence. The simple words fell like stones into still water, sending ripples of shock and disbelief throughout the assembled nobility. "I cannot bind myself to a future that feels like a betrayal of everything I believe our empire needs to become." Princess Stephanie's face went pale beneath her veil, though she maintained the rigid composure that had been drilled into her since childhood. The training of a lifetime prevented her from showing the humiliation and confusion that must have been overwhelming her in that moment. She stood like a statue carved from marble, beautiful and untouchable, even as her carefully planned future crumbled around her. Emperor Franz Joseph rose from his seat, his face a mask of imperial fury controlled by decades of diplomatic experience. The veins in his temples stood out prominently as he struggled to maintain his composure in front of Europe's most important dignitaries. His son's words had not just disrupted a wedding ceremony, they had potentially destroyed alliances that had taken years to negotiate and threatened the stability of the entire Habsburg succession. The archbishop, despite his experience with the unpredictable nature of human emotion, found himself at a complete loss for words. In all his years of conducting royal ceremonies, he had never encountered anything like this moment. The ancient protocols that governed such occasions provided no guidance for a situation where the groom simply refused to continue with the service. A buzz of shocked conversation began to rise from the wedding guests, starting as whispers but growing gradually louder as people tried to process what they had just witnessed. Ambassadors looked at each other with expressions of alarm, already calculating how this unprecedented event would affect the delicate balance of European politics. Military officers shifted uncomfortably, wondering if they should take some action to restore order to the proceedings. Rudolf turned slightly to address not just his bride, but the entire congregation that had gathered to witness what they had expected to be his triumph, not his rebellion. His voice grew stronger as he continued, drawing on reserves of conviction that had been building within him for months. For too long, our empire has tried to hold together peoples who dream of their own freedom, to maintain systems that serve the past rather than the future, he declared. How can I pledge my life to perpetuating something I believe is slowly dying? Something that may not deserve to survive in its current form. The words hit the assembled nobility like physical blows. These were not the private doubts that every royal heir might harbor, but public statements that challenged the very foundations upon which their world was built. Representatives from Hungary, Bohemia, and other restless provinces of the empire looked at each other with expressions of surprise and, in some cases, barely concealed satisfaction. King Leopold II of Belgium stood slowly, his face red with anger and embarrassment. His daughter's marriage was supposed to have been the culmination of months of careful diplomatic work, securing Belgium's future through alliance with one of Europe's great powers. Now he found himself in the humiliating position of having his daughter rejected in front of the most important people in Europe. Rudolf's personal secretary felt his heart sink as he realized that his master had chosen this most public of moments, to make a stand that would have consequences far beyond the immediate embarrassment. He had tried to counsel the prince against his increasingly radical ideas, warning him that such thoughts were dangerous for someone in his position. Now those warnings had proven prophetic in the most dramatic way possible. Empress Elizabeth remained seated, though her hands trembled slightly in her lap. As a mother, she felt torn between pride in her son's courage and terror at what his actions would mean for his future. As an empress, she understood that Rudolf had just committed what many would consider treason against his own family and empire. The political implications of his words would reverberate across Europe for years to come. Count Joseph Hoyos moved slightly closer to his friend, instinctively positioning himself to provide support if needed. He had seen Rudolf's growing disillusionment with imperial politics, but had never imagined it would lead to such a dramatic public break with everything the Habsburg family represented. Now he found himself wondering if there was any way to salvage the situation or if the damage was already irreparable. The Russian ambassador leaned forward in his seat, his mind already composing the urgent dispatch he would send to St. Petersburg within hours. This unexpected development might create opportunities for Russian influence in Central Europe that had not existed just moments before. The sudden instability in the Habsburg succession could shift the entire balance of power across the continent. Rudolf continued speaking, his voice growing more passionate as he gave voice to ideas that had been building within him for months. We live in an age when peoples demand the right to determine their own futures, when old empires must adapt or face revolution. I cannot in good conscience take vows that would require me to resist changes that may be necessary for the survival of our peoples. The cathedral began to feel like a powder keg ready to explode as the implications of Rudolph's words sank in among the various national representatives present. Hungarian nobles whispered excitedly among themselves, seeing in the prince's rebellion a possible ally for their own aspirations for greater autonomy. German representatives frowned deeply, recognizing that Austrian instability could complicate their own imperial ambitions. Princess Stephanie finally spoke, her voice clear and controlled despite the devastating circumstances. "Your Highness appears to have forgotten that royal duty sometimes requires personal sacrifice for the greater good," she said. "Perhaps you mistake noble obligation for personal preference." Her words carried their own sting, reminding everyone present that Rudolph was not just rejecting marriage to her personally, but abandoning the fundamental principle that royal individuals existed to serve their dynasties rather than themselves. The rebuke was delivered with such dignity that it somehow made Rudolph's position appear even more shocking by contrast. The French ambassador smiled slightly, recognizing that this unexpected crisis might provide France with diplomatic opportunities that had not existed earlier that morning. Austrian weakness could potentially be exploited to France's advantage in various ongoing negotiations about territorial and commercial issues that affected both nations. As Rudolph paused in his speech, the full magnitude of what he had done began to settle over everyone present. He had not simply refused to marry Princess Stephanie, he had publicly questioned the entire system of imperial authority that kept Central Europe stable. In that moment, everyone in the cathedral understood that they were witnessing not just a failed wedding ceremony, but potentially the beginning of a political crisis that could reshape the map of Europe. The silence that followed Princess Stephanie's dignified rebuke seemed to press down upon the cathedral like a physical weight. Emperor Franz Joseph stepped forward, his face a study in controlled fury, and when he spoke, his voice carried the authority of generations of Habsburg rulers who had never tolerated public defiance, even from their own children. "You will complete this ceremony," the emperor commanded, his words cutting through the air like a blade. "You will honor the commitments that have been made in your name, and you will remember that you are not merely Rudolph, but the future of this empire." But Rudolph stood his ground, drawing himself up to his full height and meeting his father's gaze without flinching. The young prince had crossed a line from which there could be no retreat, and everyone present could see the determination that had replaced his earlier hesitation. "Father, I cannot promise to preserve something that I believe needs to change," Rudolph replied. "The empire we rule contains too many peoples who dream of freedom, too many problems that cannot be solved by clinging to traditions that no longer serve their purpose." A gasp arose from the congregation as they witnessed something unprecedented in Habsburg history, a direct confrontation between emperor and heir in the most public setting imaginable. The diplomatic representatives present understood immediately that they were observing not just a family dispute, but a potential constitutional crisis that could destabilize all of Central Europe. The archbishop made a desperate attempt to restore some semblance of order to the proceedings. "Perhaps your Highness would benefit from a few moments of private reflection and prayer," he suggested diplomatically. "Such momentous decisions deserve careful consideration in solitude." But Rudolph shook his head firmly. "I have spent months in reflection, Your Grace. The decision I am making today is not impulsive, but the result of long and careful thought about my duties to the peoples of this empire, not just to its traditions." From the congregation came sounds of shifting fabric and whispered conversations as the various national representatives began to grasp the full implications of what they were witnessing. The Hungarian delegation exchanged meaningful glances, recognizing that Rudolph's rebellion might signal a new openness to their own demands for greater autonomy. The German ambassador frowned deeply, calculating how Austrian political instability might affect the delicate balance of power that kept Europe from descending into chaos. Princess Stephanie, maintaining her composure with remarkable dignity, finally addressed Rudolph directly. "Your Highness speaks of duty to peoples and empires, but what of duty to individuals who have trusted in your word? What of duty to those who have arranged their lives around promises you now choose to break?" Her words carried a personal pain that made them more effective than any political argument. Rudolph's face showed the first sign of uncertainty since he had begun his dramatic declaration. He had been thinking in terms of grand historical principles, but she had reminded him of the human cost of his actions. Emperor Franz Joseph seized upon his son's momentary hesitation. "You see the consequences of your selfishness," he declared. "You would abandon not only your bride, but every alliance and agreement that has been built upon this marriage. Your personal preferences cannot be allowed to override the needs of millions of subjects." But Rudolph's resolve seemed to strengthen rather than weaken under this pressure. "Perhaps that is exactly the problem," he replied. "Perhaps the needs of those millions of subjects should matter more than the preferences of kings and emperors. Perhaps it is time for us to listen to what our peoples actually want, rather than imposing upon them what we think they should want." The words fell upon the assembled nobility like declarations of war. Representatives from the various ethnic groups within the Austrian Empire looked at each other with expressions of amazement and hope, while the German and Austrian aristocrats appeared horrified by what they were hearing from their future emperor. Count Hoyos, Rudolph's closest friend, made a brave attempt to intervene. "Your Highness," he said quietly, "perhaps these important discussions might be better conducted in a more private setting after the immediate obligations of today have been fulfilled." Rudolph turned to his friend with an expression of sad determination. "Joseph, if I cannot be honest about my beliefs in a cathedral before God and my people, when will I ever be able to speak the truth? If I take vows today that I do not believe in, how will I ever find the courage to change what needs to be changed?" The Russian ambassador leaned back in his seat with barely concealed satisfaction, recognizing that the Habsburg family's public crisis might create opportunities for Russian expansion that had not existed just hours before. A weakened Austria-Hungary would be less able to resist Russian influence in the Balkans and Eastern Europe. Empress Elizabeth finally rose from her seat, moving with the grace and dignity that had made her famous throughout Europe. As she approached her son, every eye in the cathedral followed her movement, wondering if maternal authority might succeed where imperial command had failed. "My son," she said softly, her voice carrying clearly through the vast space. "You speak of change and truth, but there are ways to work for change that do not require the destruction of everything that has come before. Wisdom sometimes lies in working within existing systems rather than attempting to tear them down." Rudolph's expression softened as he looked at his mother, the one person in the cathedral who had always understood his struggles with the burden of imperial destiny. But even her gentle words could not shake his conviction. "Mother, I have tried to work within the system," he replied. "I have attended councils where the voices of our Hungarian subjects are ignored, where the dreams of our Slavic peoples are dismissed, where every proposal for reform is met with arguments about tradition and stability. Sometimes systems become so rigid that they can only be changed by breaking them." The cathedral erupted in barely controlled chaos as the various delegations began talking among themselves, trying to process the implications of what they were hearing. Military officers looked uncertainly at their superiors, wondering if they should take action to restore order. Church officials whispered prayers and consulted ancient protocols for guidance in unprecedented situations. King Leopold II of Belgium stood slowly, his face red with humiliation and anger. "If the House of Habsburg cannot honor its commitments to its allies," he declared loudly enough for everyone to hear, "then perhaps those allies must reconsider their own obligations." The threat was unmistakable, and its implications rippled through the congregation like waves through water. Belgium's alliance with Austria-Hungary involved trade agreements, military cooperation, and mutual defense treaties that affected the security of Central Europe. Rudolf's personal rebellion was rapidly becoming an international crisis. As the situation spiraled beyond anyone's ability to control, Rudolf stood at the center of the storm he had created, knowing that his next words would determine not just his own future, but potentially the fate of an empire that had endured for centuries. As the chaos in the cathedral reached its peak, Rudolf raised his hand for silence, and something in his demeanor commanded attention, even from those who disagreed most strongly with his actions. The young prince had found a different kind of authority, one that came not from inherited position but from personal conviction and the courage to act upon it. "I understand that my words today have caused pain and confusion," Rudolf began, his voice carrying clearly through the vast space. "I understand that I have disappointed those who trusted in me, and I understand that my actions will have consequences that extend far beyond this cathedral. But I also understand that sometimes, to prevent a greater tragedy, one must accept responsibility for a smaller one." Emperor Franz Joseph stood rigid as stone, his face reflecting the internal struggle between paternal love and imperial duty. For the first time in his long reign, he faced a challenge that could not be resolved through diplomatic negotiation or military action. His own son had become the greatest threat to the stability he had spent decades building. The assembled nobility watched in fascination and horror as the drama unfolded before them. They were witnessing not just the breakdown of a wedding ceremony, but potentially the collapse of the entire Habsburg succession. Without a clear line of inheritance, Austria-Hungary could face the kind of civil strife that had torn apart other European dynasties. Rudolf continued, his words measured but passionate. "The empire we have inherited is like a great ship that is slowly taking on water. We can continue to polish its brass and admire its beauty while it sinks, or we can acknowledge that it needs fundamental repairs to survive the storms ahead. I choose to work for those repairs, even if it means abandoning the captain's cabin." Princess Stephanie, who had maintained her dignity throughout this unprecedented ordeal, finally allowed a trace of emotion to show in her voice. "Your Highness speaks beautifully about ships and storms, but what of the passengers who believed they were boarding a vessel that would carry them safely to their destination? What of those who trusted in the promises that were made?" Her words struck Rudolf with unexpected force, reminding him that his rebellion was not just an abstract political gesture, but a personal betrayal of someone who had done nothing to deserve such treatment. For a moment, his resolve wavered as he saw the pain he had caused reflected in her eyes. But the moment passed quickly as Rudolf remembered the conversations that had led him to this decision. He thought of the Hungarian farmers who had spoken to him about their dreams of governing themselves, of the Czech intellectuals who had shared their visions of cultural revival, of the Croatian merchants who looked toward the sea and imagined their own independent future. "Your Highness," Rudolf said gently, "I believe that the greatest kindness I can show you is to refuse to bind you to a man who cannot promise to be the emperor you deserve to marry. You deserve someone who can give himself completely to the role of conservative ruler, someone who will not spend his reign questioning everything that role represents." The archbishop, desperate to salvage something from the wreckage of the ceremony, made one final attempt at mediation. "Perhaps," he suggested, "these profound questions of governance and duty might be explored after the immediate obligations of today have been fulfilled. Marriage and political philosophy need not be irreconcilable." But Rudolf shook his head with finality. "Your Grace, I cannot take vows before God that I know I will not be able to keep. I cannot promise to honor and protect an institution that I believe needs to be fundamentally transformed, perhaps even dissolved." The final word fell like a thunderclap upon the assembled congregation. To speak of dissolving the Habsburg Empire, in front of representatives from across Europe was not just political heresy, but a declaration that could trigger the very conflicts Rudolf claimed to want to prevent. Emperor Franz Joseph's control finally cracked, and his voice thundered through the cathedral. "You are no son of mine," he declared. "You are no heir to this throne. You have chosen revolution over responsibility, chaos over order, and you will live with the consequences of that choice." The words of formal disinheritance sent shockwaves through the congregation, more powerful than anything that had come before. In that moment, Rudolf ceased to be Crown Prince of Austria-Hungary and became simply a young man who had sacrificed everything for his principles. But instead of being crushed by his father's rejection, Rudolf seemed to stand taller, as if a great weight had been lifted from his shoulders. "Then I am free," he said quietly, "free to work for the changes I believe in without the burden of representing a system I cannot support." The various national representatives began calculating frantically how this unprecedented development would affect their own country's relationships with Austria-Hungary. The French ambassador smiled slightly, recognizing that Austrian political chaos might benefit French interests. The Russian delegate already composed mental dispatches about opportunities for expansion. The German representatives frowned deeply, understanding that instability in Austria-Hungary could threaten the delicate balance that kept their own empire secure. Princess Stephanie, displaying remarkable courage and dignity, stepped forward and removed her engagement ring, placing it carefully on the altar. "I thank your Highness for his honesty," she said clearly, "and I hope that history will judge whether his principles were worth the price that so many others have paid for them today." With those words, she turned and walked slowly back down the aisle, her head held high despite the whispers and stares that followed her. Her father, King Leopold II, followed with obvious anger, already planning the diplomatic steps necessary to protect Belgium's interests in the chaos that would surely follow. As the cathedral began to empty, with various delegations departing, in confusion and alarm, Rudolf stood alone at the altar where he had expected to be married. Count Hoyos approached his friend cautiously, unsure whether to offer congratulations or condolences. "What will you do now?" Hoyos asked quietly. Rudolf looked around the nearly empty cathedral, at the flowers that had been arranged for a celebration that never occurred, at the candles that still burned despite the darkness that had fallen over. "His family's dynasty. I will find another way to serve my people," Rudolf replied. "Perhaps not as an emperor, but as someone who understands that the old ways are ending, whether we guide that change or not. History will not wait for us to be ready." As the last guests departed and the great doors of the cathedral closed, Rudolf of Habsburg walked out into a Vienna that would never see him as crown prince again. Behind him lay the wreckage of centuries of tradition and carefully planned alliances. Ahead lay an uncertain future in which he would have to forge a new identity based not on inherited privilege, but on personal conviction. The wedding that was supposed to secure the Habsburg succession had instead marked its end. In the years that followed, Austria-Hungary would indeed face the transformations that Rudolf had predicted, though they would come through war and revolution rather than reform and gradual change. History would remember this day not as the beginning of a new imperial dynasty, but as the moment when one young man chose principle over power, and in doing so changed the course of European history forever. The bells of Vienna, which had been prepared to ring in celebration, remained silent that evening, their bronze voices stilled by the magnitude of what had transpired. In palaces and peasant cottages alike, people would speak in whispers about the prince who had halted before the altar and in that moment of refusal made history weep for what might have been.